Okay, last lecture on government was a few days ago. I don't remember what I exactly said, but this lecture is going to really focus on the flexibility of government. There is a little three branches worksheet for you that I included on today's lesson. You can go through it and read about the magistrates, the Senate, and the assemblies, and you might compare them to our government: legislative, executive, judicial. But really what I want to talk about today is flexibility. Governments have to be flexible. When our founding fathers established their government, they built in a lot of flexibility into our government. Now, the very first time after they created the Constitution, even the Constitution is a second run of our government. They started our country with what was called the Articles of Confederation, and they didn't last very long because the states were too powerful, the federal government had no power, and they went, this is not going to work. And so they flipped it and made the federal government much more powerful. When you look at the expanding voting rights on the lecture handout, it shows you that we expanded the suffrage quite a bit. And so it went from just white male Protestants that owned property to dropping that property requirement, eventually including slaves, former slaves, African Americans, and even women. And in the 1970s, it dropped down to age 18. The reasoning, and I think that was the fastest amendment to the Constitution in history. The argument back then was the soldiers that were fighting in Vietnam said, if I'm old enough to die in the war, I should be old enough to vote for who sends me to war. Now, one thing, if you don't know by now, life changes. It is not static. Static means unchanging. It stays the same. Okay, life is very dynamic. It will flip on us all the time. In fact, right now, perfect time to talk about it. The coronavirus that flipped our world on its ear. And so now I teach from home in my beautiful, lovely classroom, American flag, nice maps, and a little kitty that'll interrupt me every now and then. But life is dynamic. It changes rapidly. And our government needs to have those tools. Okay, one tool is that amendment process to expand that electorate and do other things too. Now, the next thing that they have too is something that will actually constrict and make the government more powerful. Right now, our state and our country, the United States, is the first nationwide emergency declaration. And so President Trump went through and declared that we have a national emergency. And that enables the federal government to do different things that it doesn't normally have the power for. Okay, in Washington State, Governor Inslee declared that that state emergency earlier in the month or a month ago or so. And that's when he said, no more school, you're going home. Different cities have done that citywide emergency where they restricted who can be out, when they can be out, all those things. When I was a little kid, I remember we had a curfew. We had to be in at night in the summertime. I think it was either 7 or 8 o'clock at night. I don't remember why. I was a little kid. I was up to third grade. But we'd have to be in at night, and we couldn't be out and running around and playing games. And so emergencies, they happen, and our governments need that power. Now, in an extreme emergency, our government will actually restrict the power even more, or it will have more power. In the United States, it is called martial law. Martial law is when the government actually puts the military in charge of all the civil functions of the government. The last time we had martial law exercised in the United States was, I believe, during the Freedom Riders. The Freedom Riders were people who were advocating for civil rights, equal rights, and they hopped on Greyhound buses in mixed racial company, which was a big crime in the South. And they rode from the East Coast all the way down to Mississippi, New Orleans. And it was very violent until the military had to step in and accompany those people and make sure that they wouldn't get attacked. I was kind of surprised. I thought martial law had been declared in other times. I know New Orleans had Katrina, which was a pretty nasty time, but that was just an emergency. In 1992, Los Angeles had riots, again based on race, where Rodney King, the officers that had beaten him were declared not guilty. and a lot of people didn't take that very well, and it was not a very good time. Lots of people died that time. Up here, Romans, patricians and plebeians. The patricians were the people that controlled the government at first, and the plebeians, kind of like people of different races, they wanted their rights, but they were seen as different people. And so the common people didn't have those rights until several years later when they campaigned and they actually got it. I think the patricians were afraid that the plebeians would actually break away from Rome if they didn't get their house of plebes. Take a look at that chapter review I put on there. Yes, it has the answer key on the last 2 pages. Ignore that if you can. Answer it. If you do look at the answer key, right, self-graded. I'll still give you credit. It's not a big deal. And if you have any questions, shoot me an email. I'll handle it for you. Nice to talk to you. Talk to you later.